Dan Kieran co-founded Unbound in 2011, bringing crowdfunding to publishing and shaking up an entire sector. In this episode of Sound Advice Entrepreneurs Unfiltered, Dan shares how it feels to start and run a business and how he kept his sanity intact during and after his time as CEO. He is the best friend that every entrepreneur needs. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Dan. I want to go back to the beginning of Unbound. You came up with the idea for it back in 2009 while clearing out a rat-infested basement in Bognor Regis. Tell us about that light bulb moment.
Well, yeah, so to go back a little bit before then, I spent 10 years writing books. I had a very successful career. My first book was a big hit called Crap Towns, about the worst places to live in Britain. And it did very well. And basically over the years, I got closer to writing the books I wanted to write, but my sales figures were sort of declining. And after the crash of 2008, publishers were becoming even more risk averse. And they were looking, basically only really interested in trying to find bestsellers. And I effectively lost my livelihood overnight. And because I'm a double university dropout and don't have any kind of safety net, I was back doing minimum wage jobs. The same kind of jobs I was doing before I sort of set out on my path to trying to become a successful author. And so I was clearing out the rat-infested basement of an accountant's in Bognor Regis, and I was on my lunch break, and I was looking out to sea, and I realised I'd sold like 300,000 copies of my books to people around the world over the previous decade, but I didn't have the name and address of a single person that had ever bought one. And I realised I'd completely put myself at the mercy of all these gatekeepers, all these people between me and the readers. And I realised that someone had to build a platform that allowed authors and readers to come together, so that publishers wouldn't decide what books were published, but that readers would. And this was a really important insight, actually, that publishers don't sell books to readers, they sell them to shops. So by cutting out the middleman, you could not only get authors more money, but you could also massively diversify the types of books that were being published, because you were going straight to readers and saying, what do you want? So it was a kind of revolutionary idea, but it also felt like it was harnessing the best of emerging technologies. Twitter was only a few years old at the time. Authors were just beginning to harness their audiences themselves. So we were very lucky with our timing. Kickstarter was 2 years old. Crowdfunding was hot. So the stars kind of aligned, but it was, I always look back on it and I was so grateful that I didn't have that safety net. And I think it's something that a lot of entrepreneurs have, is they don't have any choice. And that can be incredibly motivating. And it certainly was for me.
It was a case of survival.
Yeah. And I think when you've got nothing to lose, you may as well go for your dream. And that is what entrepreneurship is. Like it's talked about in quite kind of macho ways, but essentially you're trying to make your mark on the world. You're trying to make an impact, and you're going for the thing you believe in. And it's so crucial that you run a business that you do believe in, because it's going to take so much out of you, which is what my book's about, really, about how much pressure you get put under and how you can cope with that and how you can handle the mental health challenges that are going to come whilst running a business. Because, as I say, the language around business and entrepreneurship is still so macho, and it can be incredibly lonely doing those things. It's incredibly exciting, but it can be tough mentally too.
I'd love to talk to you about some of those pressures, because I know you hatched the plan for Unbound in a pub with two of your mates, John and Justin, but you took on the CEO role. What were some of the responsibilities of that role, and how did you earn your new job title?
Yeah, so we were in the pub talking about who was going to do what, and they both pointed out to me that I was the only one of the three of us that didn't have a job. So they were like, Dan, you should be CEO. And of course, as I say, I had nothing to lose. I was like, well, I'll go for it. What the hell? Let's do it. I didn't have a clue what it entailed. And I very quickly learned that in every walk of life, other than being an entrepreneur, your job title is a kind of confirmation of status that you've already achieved in the eyes of the people around you, hence the promotion. But obviously, as an entrepreneur, you get called the boss long before you've proven you're capable of being one. And I think this is when I started to realize that I was going to have to find a way to make sure my abilities progressed beyond the demands my business was going to make of me. And I had a huge problems of mental health in my late teens. I had terrible panic attacks and was agoraphobic for years. So I was aware that I had issues I needed to deal with, but there's something about being an entrepreneur and all of your weaknesses are put under a spotlight. And you have to face those issues or you will fail. Not least because you will put them in your business. Like, that's what entrepreneurs don't realize, that you're going to put all of your flaws and your faults in your company because you effectively build it out of yourself. And you have to do that in the first instance, because before you've built a business anyone can believe in, you have to make people believe in you. And this is why it's so exciting and why you're prepared to push yourself to such extreme lengths to make it successful. But of course, the flip side of that is that it means that if anything happens to the business or it fails, that becomes an existential threat to you personally. And I think this is what the highs and lows of the entrepreneurial journey are, that people, I hadn't read that in many places. I hadn't heard that from lots of entrepreneurs. And so that was my challenge. I thought, well, I'm going to have to evolve myself as an individual while the business grows. And that's what will keep me ahead of the challenges I'm going to face. And that is what I learned, and it worked. And that's the thing I'm desperate to share with other entrepreneurs now, because I feel like that second journey of your own development is actually the one that determines whether or not you're successful. And that's not widely discussed, I don't think.
As a double university dropout, someone who was thrust into this position of boss with no prior experience of running a business, how did you get over that initial feeling of imposter syndrome?
I think, well, to be honest, I drank a lot. I did all the things that you do when you're stressed, which you think are going to help, which don't. I also made tons of mistakes. I learned very quickly that you can't throw your weight around. I think part of the problem is the models of leadership that we've come to see in the media and certainly in the entrepreneurial circles, the ways things are discussed. It's all about toughness, being hard. When actually, if you actually look at genuinely brilliant leaders, they're all soft. They may do things which are difficult. They won't shy away from tough decisions, and they'll be fierce if they have to be, but they do it from a position of gentleness and softness inside. And I was doing therapy around that time to sort of help me overcome those challenges. And looking at anger, getting frustrated, what I realized was that if you show your emotions, if you get angry with people, you just immediately lose them. Lots of entrepreneurs think, I just have these character flaws that people have to put up with because I'm the boss. And it's like, that's not effective leadership. And I think that's the challenge, is are you prepared to do what the business needs, but also look in the mirror, and are you prepared to work on yourself? Because ultimately, if you're the boss, that's the primary driver of whether the business is going to be successful. I always say this to investors, the one thing all your money is dependent on is the mental health of your CEOs that you're investing in. It's not technology, it's not the internet. It's how well they're able to cope with difficulties and unforeseen situations. So I was lucky early on to realize that my weaknesses were things that would have to be dealt with. I hadn't flown for 20 years, so I had a flying phobia, things like that. I mean, I was lucky in that was an obvious thing I needed to engage with, which, guess what, turned out to be nothing to do with flying. But that process of learning about myself made me curious and excited about genuinely leading people, because it's such a privilege to do it and to see people grow and to nurture that growth and give them what they need to succeed for you. It's a strange thing. You do it out of self-interest, but it's in everyone's interest. Like, there's a way of aligning the business's interests with the self-interests of the people in the organization. And I think the truly great CEOs are able to make sure those two things are aligned and articulate why that alignment is so important.
And I know that you also made the decision to give up drink, even though the sort of early days of Unbound were spent in the pub. So at what stage did you make that decision, and how did it change you as an entrepreneur and CEO?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those, as I say at the beginning, I always say starting a company, a startup, it's like being in a rock band, right? Like you're all a gang, you're all in it together. You do work crazy hours, but a lot of those hours are spent because socializing and work is mixed. And I think that's a really exciting component of the startup culture. But a few years in, my wife, Isabel, got pregnant, and she obviously she gave up booze as part of that. And I decided to give up, to kind of just share her teetotal pain. But very quickly, I felt like I had a superpower, and every morning I would wake up feeling amazing. And I was probably getting drunk 2 or 3 times a week, as I had done my entire life up till that point, pretty much. But a few months in, I sort of stopped and looked at it and thought about it. And I realised that this was the first time, I was now 40 odd, and realised this was the first time since I was 15 that I was learning what I was like as an adult without regularly ingesting a depressant. And it just seemed this astonishing piece of information that I'd never considered, that all this drinking was actually making me feel worse about myself, in myself. It was damaging me physically, but it was damaging my ability to be a successful leader and run a successful company. And so I stopped, and I didn't drink for a long time. And I ended up developing rules around drinking, which was that I don't drink as a consolation because something's gone wrong. And I don't drink as a reward for things that have gone well. And what I found by deploying those 2 rules of drinking was that I didn't drink, which was quite instructive. That it was a crutch for when things were difficult, and then I woke up and felt worse and was in a less, in a worse frame of mind to deal with whatever had caused me to drink in the first place. Or I was taking a moment of success, celebrating it by ingesting huge quantities of a depressant, which made me feel terrible the next day. And I think it's just something in the culture in the UK. We've all grown up with it. Alcohol and fun has sort of become synonymous in our minds. And I think it's really important to disconnect them and to just make sure whether you're doing it consciously or out of habit. And it's single-handedly the best thing I did in terms of my chance of being a successful entrepreneur was giving up booze without question. Simply because it just, every morning I woke up and I felt great, and I just felt more able to handle the difficulties that inevitably arose.
So it became a way for you to get to know your own self sober. But did it also change the culture of the company in some ways? If so many of those early days had been spent in the pub, did you have to stop socialising with employees in that way?
Yes, I did. I mean, that was another part of my evolution as a boss. I think in the early days, I felt like I needed to be there. I wanted to be there. I mean, we were all friends. But as we got further and the business became more successful, I sort of realised that my role was taking me away from the rest of the team socially. And that was a really important moment too, because number one, the team need time when you're not there so they can moan about you, which I think is really important to give them that space. I mean, I would always go for a drink or 1 or 2, but then I would very deliberately leave. Also, if you stay in the pub all night, people start telling you how to run your business and they get a bit more confident the more they've had to drink, which can be less helpful. Also, it creates the perception that there's a clique around you, like people that go to drinking with you are closer to you than everybody else, and it can just start to cause problems in the culture of the company if you're perceived to be more available to some people rather than others. To be fair, though, the younger generation, I mean, I'm 47, but the people, our employees in their 20s seem much less focused on alcohol actually than I was when I was that age. I do think there's a shift around that, which is interesting and very positive. But we were having just as much fun, I should hasten to add. Like it wasn't that we were lacking in fact, we were having more fun, I think, as a team, and the culture got much better because there wasn't this default expectation that team things had to involve going to the pub or alcohol. Became a bit more creative about how we did those things, which was welcomed, I know, by lots of the members of the team. So alcohol's a tricky one, but yeah, it's something to just become super conscious of running a business, because it can very easily get you into difficulties when it doesn't have to.
And of course, some of your other big responsibilities as CEO was building the brand and telling the Unbound story, but also, of course, raising money. I wanted to talk to you about pitching, because you've said the smell of fear repels investors. So how did you get rid of your own feelings of fear and inferiority around investors?
Yeah, I became so fascinated by this. And again, because I spent so much time on my own evolution, I had by this stage realised that fear drove a lot of my decision making. And I think that happens to a lot of us, whether we're aware of it or not. Very, very often we act on the basis of the fear of something that may happen. And fundraising is such an exposing exercise. You're basically going to someone and saying, here's this beautiful thing I've made, and you're asking them to judge you and then, prove how much they're interested in your idea by giving you money. So it's potentially toxic. It's bad for your ego gets caught up in it. It's a bit like stand-up. You become like a stand-up comedian that raises money instead of gets laughs, and it's incredibly exciting because of that. I mean, imagine standing in a room full of people and telling them a story, and then them saying, "Yeah, here's £1 million to go and make it happen." I mean, this is why we're entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that is amazing privilege, and to be able to do that kind of thing. But to be able to show up as the best version of yourself in those meetings means you've got to understand your fear. You've got to deconstruct it. You've got to understand why you're so afraid and why you're so nervous. And it's pretty obvious why, because in the event of you not raising the money, your business won't exist anymore. And I think that I'd always say that being an entrepreneur is like going to a casino with your reputation. And by the time you realize it, the roulette wheel is spinning and your reputation is on it. So I think the stakes are incredibly high with fundraising, and that's why people find it so difficult. So what I did was I basically tried to work out why I was so afraid of. And in the end, I worked out I was scared of letting my wife down, because if I didn't raise the money, the business would fold and I wouldn't have a job and our lives would change radically. So the way I dealt with that was by sitting down and talking to her about it and saying, I say in the book, had this conversation, honey, I'm fundraising, and if I can't do it and it doesn't work, then our lives are going to change. And we would have this conversation about what we would do in the event of that happening. And it was one of the best conversations I've ever had. And we had it many times, every time we did a raise, and it would always end in the same way with us just planning what we would do. Well, we'd leave London and we'd have to sell the house, but we would maybe live more close to our parents, and we maybe get some more help with the kids, and like, well, maybe we'll see you more because you won't be working so hard. And I'm like, well, that's true. And she was like, well, I would actually, if that happened, I'd quite like to retrade. And oh, well, that would be great. You really deserve to do that. And by the end of the conversation, we were in a position where we're like, man, this sounds great.
Plan B became very appealing.
Yeah, suddenly you're like, oh, so if I don't achieve this thing of fundraising, we've now mapped out a path to a life that we both want. And the reason that was so powerful and so empowering is it meant that when I then stood in a room with investors, I still wanted to raise the money. I still cared about raising the money. I just wasn't scared of not raising it. And neutralizing your fear and your anxiety gives you superpowers. It's a bit like when you give up booze. You just suddenly have this extra level of self-belief. So those conversations with Isabel were completely, that's why I've continued to raise the money we needed, even in incredibly difficult conditions like the pandemic and Brexit. And again, that became something that I became super conscious of, that my own fear was getting in my way most of the time. Because that was interesting, that the merits of investing in Unbound at that point were no different. The story was the same, the business performance was the same, the metrics were the same, but how I felt in my own mind was what would determine whether we raised the money, which again is a source of huge pressure. So learning that and learning to get your own head in the right place becomes incredibly powerful. And as to your point a little bit earlier, your staff see you doing this. They see you raising your game. And all of a sudden, this job title that you were given when you didn't really deserve it, all of a sudden, you're emulating that job title. They're seeing it in you and they're seeing you change. And that's quite inspiring for people, because then they do the same thing. And if you show them that that's valued in your business, that going on those evolutionary journeys, I mean, staff used to say to me, how do I get a pay rise? And I'd be like, well, show me you're evolving as an individual. Show me the thing you were scared of doing that you've now confronted and dealt with, whatever it is. And they sort of look at me like I was mad. But the point is that if they were prepared to do that, they'd be more valuable to the business, because I'd be hiring the people working for me would be on that journey too. So that's why I think it's so incredibly powerful. And it makes you so much more likely to be successful, as you can imagine, because you've got that self-belief and you're just driving yourself forward all the time.
You talk a lot about confronting and neutralising fear, and you mentioned earlier that you started speaking to a therapist. I know you also started working with a business coach. At what stage did you do that and why?
Yeah, I used different coaches at different times. The first coach I used was around very specific issues with the business. I felt like I needed someone. I met him for breakfast every couple of weeks, and I would just basically use him as a confidential sounding board. And he would never tell me what to do, but in me articulating the problems I was having, I would very often come up with the answers myself, and which is true of the best coaches. And then the second time was much later on, when I felt like I'd reached the edge of what I was capable of. And this is a huge theme in entrepreneurship, where I got away with it. I felt like I got away with it at the beginning, and we were growing, and we had, multi-million-pound in revenue, and we had like 30 members of staff. And I felt like I'd got to a point, and I was no longer sure if I could carry on progressing beyond that point. And so I got a coach to help me understand that those definitions I'd come to accept about myself were stories I told myself and were not necessarily true. And that was a huge moment. I also did a therapeutic retreat called the Hoffman process, which was really extraordinarily powerful, which really helps you disentangle the stories you're telling yourself about what you can do and where your limits are. I also, one of the things I was terrible at was DIY. And I met an amazing man who builds wooden surfboards called James Otter. And I went and spent a week in Cornwall with him building a surfboard in his workshop. And what was interesting about the surfboard was that even if you achieve certain things, if you wake up one morning and you're feeling depressed and terrible, you can very easily persuade yourself that all your achievements were not because of anything you did. Oh, I only got that because I was lucky, or this thing happened, or I did it with somebody else who was really talented. You can persuade yourself that you don't deserve the things about yourself. What was interesting about the surfboard is that I didn't believe I'd be able to make one, but it turned out I was able to make one with the right teacher. And now on my wall, I have this beautiful, physical, amazing wooden surfboard. So it's a physical representation of my ability to go beyond what I think I'm capable of. And I can't deny it when I'm feeling low and in a low mood, because it's a physical thing I can touch on the wall. And so I work with entrepreneurs now, and part of the thing I work with them on is how do we change the limitations they've come to believe exist about themselves, and how do you help people redefine their sense of who they are? Because that is how you progress along with the demands your business is going to place on you. And it's such a thrilling journey that the personal journey of evolution is much more thrilling than the business one, actually. And well, I'm sure we'll come to it, but it also enables you to leave. Like, that's why you can leave a business in the end. It's because you've gone on that journey. So it's incredibly important for you, for the long term of your life, beyond the time of running the business that you're doing.
You're right. I think so much of fear stems from the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So that's really powerful that you sort of confronted that head on. So in terms of the therapy and the coaches and the surfboard and the retreat, was that enough to protect your own mental health as the business grew?
Not always, but what it allowed me to develop was the confidence to spot when the mental health toll was too much, and to say, actually, I don't have to constantly be ahead of this. There are moments when I can actually say this is enough, and this is too much. And asking for help is very difficult. I know there's a lot of talk about how everyone's much more open about mental health now, but if you're the CEO of a business with, venture capital investors or whatever, if you start to show signs that you're not up to the job, you'll get replaced very quickly, because the needs of shareholders are paramount. So I think there's a huge pressure to deny when things are too difficult. And I think as entrepreneurs, we're very bad at being honest with ourselves when we need a break. And that certainly happened to me. I got to the point with the business where I felt like I had achieved everything I set out to achieve, but I didn't feel this amazing feeling of euphoria I was expecting. I described it to a friend, and it was like, oh, it sounds like you climbed a mountain, but when you got to the top, you realized it wasn't yours. And I felt a little bit like that. I think there is definitely a type of entrepreneur, of which I am one, for whom building a business is like I describe it as like having a neon sign above your head saying, love me. You don't feel good enough in and of yourself. So you feel like you have to create this thing that everybody outside of you agrees has merit and is valuable. Steve Jobs famously said, you've got to make a dent in the universe. And he was a famously complicated man. So building a business and being successful running a business will not give you peace of mind. It will not deliver you happiness. It will deliver you lots of incredibly enriching and nourishing things and be a wonderful thing to do. But in the end, if you're expecting it to deliver something that you don't already have inside you, it will let you down. So part of this second journey, which is so amazing, is as you go on it, the business matters to you less. You stop seeing it as a way of shoring up your sense of low self-esteem or inadequacy. And you start to imagine your life without this thing you built to prove yourself to the world on someone else's terms almost. And that's definitely where I got to, where it wasn't that I couldn't do it. It wasn't that it was really destroying me. I just got to the stage where I thought, well, I don't want this anymore. This isn't the thing I want to spend my life doing now. And leaving a business is incredibly difficult. And lots of entrepreneurs get pushed out before they're ready because they built it out of themselves. So the idea of leaving it is existential. It's incredibly challenging. That's why the second journey is so powerful, because it allows you to disconnect yourself from it over time, so that when the moment comes when you go, actually, I'm not sure if this is for me, it no longer feels like you and the business are the same thing. And I'm incredibly proud of Unbound, and I'm thrilled that it's been so successful and that it continues to be successful without me, frankly. But it's something I did. It's not who I am. And I think that's really important, to have that sense of perspective that the time of you running your business will come to an end, and you need to run it every day being aware of that. It can't be this cipher that protects you out in the world from the things you're nervous about. But it's a fantastic vehicle to learn about yourself in the process.
And actually, you said the final act of leadership is knowing when to let go. So how did you know when to let go? How did you come to terms with that decision? And how did your co-founders react to that?
So I always said, when you start and run a business, you have 3 jobs. One is the vision. Why are you doing it? Why is the world a better place for the existence of this business you're going to make? The second thing is make sure you never run out of money, that the business is properly capitalized. So, which is why you're constantly raising money in your mind, if not in any other way. And then the third one is you've got to hire people that are better than you in every role. And this is, again, a very challenging thing to accept, that the moment of success in your business is when you create the business to be so successful, there's no longer a seat for you. And this is something that a lot of founders find deeply challenging, this idea that it doesn't need them anymore. But again, the second journey is what gets you to a place where, what it allowed me was I saw it was time for me to go before anybody else did. And trust me, that is the best way for that to happen. Because if you don't, it will get to a point where the business decides it needs to get rid of you. And so being able to see it coming meant that I could prepare for it. I was clear where the business had to have got to in terms of its revenue and profitability before I would leave. And I had a path to where I needed it to get to. I did a fundraise. It was properly financed. It was in the best possible position, best numbers we had ever done. So I created it. And also I was gradually stepping back. The thing about hiring people that are better than you in every role is you get these incredibly ambitious people around you that want more and more responsibility. And so you just gradually let them have it. And over time, it meant that when I left, the day-to-day impact was very minimal. Because people had already been running it around me and I wasn't needed in the way I had been. The conversation with co-founders is difficult, but again, one of our big rules at the beginning was that we would prioritize our friendship as co-founders ahead of the business, which was a very easy thing to say when you're starting out and much more difficult when you're, running it years and years in. But it meant I had a very open friendship and relationship with them both, and they knew that I was getting tired. They knew that I just felt like the skill set I had developed was no longer the one the business needed. It's a mature company now. Entrepreneurs are it's just a very different skill set. Some people can make that transition, but it wasn't something that interested me in the same way. So yeah, I was just incredibly open with them. They were surprised. Lots of hugs, a few tears from me. And it took time for them to get their heads around it, I think. But again, they trusted me, they trusted themselves, they knew the business was maturing. And it was done in a very slow, considered, non-frightening way, because it was so important to keep the business stable and for it not, frighten the horses, as they say. But again, having that second journey is what allows you to make that transition, which is why it's a great thing to do because you're a better entrepreneur, you're a better boss, but it also just gives you that little bit of self-awareness you need when the time comes when this potentially threatening thing happens and you have to leave the company that you started.
Yeah. It's a really crucial tip to fire yourself before someone else has to do it for you.
Yeah.
So tell us about your journey now, because I know that you said Unbound had become your shield. So how does it feel now without it?
So it's really disconcerting. I mean, I basically saved up enough money to have a year afterwards where I didn't have to earn money, just so I could kind of come to terms with what I'd done, really. And that's when I wrote this book, because I wanted to get everything I learned down in a format while it was still fresh in my mind, while I was in a good position to share it. But losing the job title was really tough. I mean, the first month or so, I was frantically posting on LinkedIn to prove to myself I was still relevant. Really fascinating, actually, how you suddenly lose these badges and you're like, oh, who am I without them? But that is why I left, because what I learned was that Unbound had become a prism I was living my life through. So everything I did in my life was experienced through the prism of what was going on with the business at that time, with bath time with my kids, dinner with my wife, with my friends in the pub, whatever it was. And I realized that if I didn't take that prism off, I would forget it was there. And then I would realize it was there 30 years down the line, having not done what I was supposed to do next. So while I found it very disconcerting, that was also, I knew I needed to do it. Because what's fascinating is when you build a company and you prove yourself against the world in that way and you have level of success, what you never think of is what that means you're going to feel like once it's gone away. And actually, that's the moment of the great nourishment, because you've left the thing. It's no longer your shield. You're standing without it, but it's something that you did, and it's something that has helped you grow and evolve as a person. So, of course, now I look around the world and I've got all these ideas of things I want to do. I'm writing lots of books. I mean, most of my time I'm a stay-at-home dad now. I do 3 days a week at home with my kids, looking after my 2-year-old and my 6-year-old. I'm just filled with promise now. I'm just thinking, well, I don't believe there's anything I can't do now. I've got a huge sense of passion for the future and excitement, but also I'm not in a rush. I don't feel like I have to do anything soon. So I feel incredibly lucky to have had the experience I had, and it's made me such a different person, and I like myself so much more now than I did when I began. I mean, in fact, John said to me, I met him, my co-founder, I met him quite recently for a walk, and he said, God, when we first started Unbound, you were a really angry, upset man. You were really, I could really tell like life had really kicked you, and you were really hungry for something. He said, now you just seem so calm and relaxed. And I do think that. I think we do businesses to help us evolve for a reason. And yeah, I mean, it was the making of me in so many ways.
Dan, thank you so much for sharing all your pearls of wisdom. And I think if you do need another role, you could definitely be a founder therapist, because you've got so many great tips and anecdotes to share. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's been a real privilege. Thanks for having me.
You can connect with Dan on Twitter at Dan_Kieran and via his website, dankieran.com. And don't forget to pick up a copy of his book, Do Start. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. See you soon for more unfiltered stories on Sound Advice.